You said, of course, data is meaningless if it's just data. And when we talk about development, we almost always get trapped, it seems, in this circle of episodic interventions and the lack of, a sustainable, long-term, evidence-based business case to continue. But the data that continues to be accumulated, as these reports indicate, seem to me to be rather conclusive on the issue of competitiveness. If you are a country and you are, clearly the ones who are higher in the Global Gender Gap Report are doing better economically and competitively. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a strong correlation. Now, that's not causation. We don't necessarily know all the things that go into making that happen, but I think to a very large extent that does support this case, that if women make up 1/2 of the sort of brain power in your country, then if you're not using that efficiently, you're going to start lagging behind.
And wasn't there a report in Kenya not long ago when they measured the GNP in a certain area based on how many more years girls stayed in school, to use your example, Iris? I guess my question is leading as to how much data do we need to accumulate? How many times do we need to hear the story, see the results before we buy that, yes, it's a good thing, it makes a difference?
Yeah, Pat, if I may. So I think the business case is an opportunity for us. But really where I think we should spend most of our effort and time is on how we close those gaps. And that's really, I'm kind of building on what everyone has said here. So trying out different things, because it is hard. We don't know exactly what works and what doesn't work. So thinking education, it could be that parents don't want to send their daughters to school, but it could also be that there's something wrong with the schools. We know teacher absenteeism is huge in many countries. Teacher salaries are very, very low. So, and maybe the curriculum is not, appropriate for the girls. So that's exactly what Jenny talked about when she talked about these experiments, and you should really think of those as experiments that are now really important in our community. Going out into the communities, into the world, into organizations to co-develop with organizations, with communities, interventions to close those gaps. And that's kind of where the work of the Women in Public Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School is really focusing on. So how can we learn about what works and what doesn't work in all these areas? And if I may, I have to tell you one study which I think is just illuminating and important for us in terms of the missing girls. That's a study by a former colleague of mine, Rob Jensen, who looked at the missing girls problem in India and exploited something that you all are aware of, and that is the explosion of call centers in India. Mm-hmm. And the interesting aspect of call centers is that they preferably hire women. And so what he was interested in was the question of, what if we go into 200 villages, educate the population of those villages about call center jobs, and then help them find jobs, which is primarily women? Is that going to affect how parents treat their daughters? Right? So he wasn't primarily interested in increasing economic opportunities, but of course he did increase economic opportunities with that. But then he had 200 villages and 200 control villages, which didn't have that kind of education. And so he measured body mass index, height, survival chances of 0 to 5-year-olds with this question in mind, which of course is an important one if you know the context, where we've been thinking it's all culture and it's just very complicated, and these very, very poor families probably won't respond to returns on investment. It turns out it works. This was a 10-year study. It turns out it works, that in villages where girls have better opportunities, and these are the 0 to 5-year-olds, parents start treating their daughters better, feed them better, their survival chances increase. So economic opportunity, while we care about economic opportunity for its own sake, and because it's outrageous that there's a 60 percentage point gap, the role model effect of economic opportunities and increasing economic opportunities and the effect it has on literally survival chances of girls is important, and makes me optimistic that these kinds of studies, very evidence-based, but working with the communities and the practitioners, and many of you in this room, and then learning from that evidence for other parts of the world, is really the way forward.
Hearing about these models, I mean, I completely agree, and what we want to focus our questions on too, as we engage with the audience, is really how do we do it? I mean, what are the connections that we make between the evidence and the data and the reports that have been shared here, as well as others that are done? How do we make the connections between that and the policies that we should be fighting for, advocating around, joining together? And I'm wondering where you feel the reports guide us. Jenny, you mentioned in your report the correlation between where women have access to mobile phones, for example. And I suspect all of us could give examples of where we've seen that make very dramatic difference economically in terms of safety and security. So, you know, does that argue then that there should be an investment in media policy or progressive reform or technology entrepreneurs? I'm trying to, you know, let's take one sector and look at what would be the policy implication.
I mean, I think that there are still enormous gaps. So, for example, we have the excess female mortality, which in important sense points to investments in water and sanitation, for example. There have been enormous gains in female enrollment in universities, but there are still 35 million girls, primary school, elementary age school girls, out of school. So I think it's important to bear in mind that there are these other major gaps. There's huge wage gaps. I think the global average is 80%, but in Bangladesh the gap is 88%. Woman earns 12 cents for every dollar earned by a man. So what the report does, and then there are these major problems around voice and agency, around gender-based violence. So it's very difficult, I think, to kind of prioritize, if you like, globally. I think that's why the work is needed, the analysis is needed at the country level, and then the drill down to see what makes sense. It's not that necessarily we have to choose between those. You know, we should be moving on multiple fronts, and as Iris has already alluded to, there can be important synergies as well. So you can tackle one kind of major priority and it can have quite important synergies across other areas as well. But it's very much, I think, like in this country, building up kind of coalitions kind of for reform, for change, for discussion, working out how interventions might make sense and then to push for change. But then we multiply that by 193 kind of at least UN member states around the world, so there's enormous challenges.
Right, and probably unfair just to pull out one sector and one question, but just to try and drill down a bit on how the reports inform. And Sadia, you did reference, and I think I remember that there were, the percentage might have been somewhere around 15% improvement in certain gaps. And so where did you find, what was the reason for those improvements primarily? What were the implications of what you found?
Again, because we're looking at this sort of 30,000-foot, 135-country type study, it's been hard to really pinpoint what were the specific policies that have moved forward. But one thing is clear, in the last 6 years that we've been looking at this data, 85% of the countries have made progress. So that's good news. 15% are falling behind, but 85% of the countries have made progress. And by and large, that progress has come from major changes in terms of economic participation and to some extent political empowerment. The political empowerment piece has moved forward primarily because of quotas. Not always, but that's been one big piece of it. On the economic participation side, that's where, as Iris said, there's starting to be a pretty strong business case. Women are making up increasingly the majority of those that are coming out of tertiary education. The world's economy today is so often based on ideas and innovation that we're in this era of talentism. There's a lot of research that shows that diverse teams perform better. And so in this sort of a scenario, focusing on gender parity is no longer this nice to have, and that's what businesses are starting to realize. It's actually, there's critical business case to be made for why those changes have to happen. One of the problems that we found is, and Iris has been involved in some of this work with our Global Agenda Council, is that businesses tend to have one-off specific interventions that focus on just one piece of gender parity within their entire business or organization. And two, that's really seen as an internal matter. That's not something, besides a few high-profile initiatives like Coca-Cola or Goldman Sachs, in general, it's seen as a sort of internal issue, particularly for things that are addressing internal structures of companies rather than CSR programs. And so what we've tried to do is, one, maybe try to create some of that collaboration, facilitate some of that exchange, and two, try to promote this holistic approach. You can't just address your entry-level gaps. You can't just address your supply chain gaps. You actually have to look across a broad spectrum of issues. And what we've launched today is a repository of successful practices, pooling together practices from over 120 companies from across the world, and ask them to tell us, so what was the specific gap you were addressing, which part of your organization it was addressing, two, what was the specific practice you put in place, how well did it work, so where did you start out, where did you end up, we're asking for results, what were the success factors and what were the barriers. And the idea is another organization can go in there, go shopping for practices that work for them, and no one practice is going to work for everyone, but you can take a look at this sort of holistic overview and then start implementing some of these changes. So that business case is really the area where we can probably make a lot of progress.
This report is being done now?
Just got launched today. It's on our website.
Well, this sounds hugely important. And so you don't have this evidence, but is one of the practices that you're testing, realizing I'm walking into controversial territory here, but is quotas and the effect, because it seems to me if you look at the top countries in your global gap index, many of them have quotas on women in leadership.
There were 2 organizations that submitted quota practices. And one of them in particular was quite honest about it led to a lot of backlash. There were a lot of men that needed to be convinced in particular, a lot of women who did not want to be part of a quota system because they felt they would then be seen as the quota candidate rather than there on their own merit. But that they made that commitment for the very top because otherwise progress would simply not happen in time. And 2, because they're also starting, I mean, as you know, the EU is starting to look at quotas.
Yes.
And so before that becomes something that they have to scramble to try to address, it's something they felt they have to start doing now. They're going to be lagging behind. So they were quite honest about, yes, it's difficult, but it's one of the best tools we've got.
You have a response, Iris?
Can I add to that? I mean, quotas are controversial, as you said, Pat, but they are absolutely the most effective means to change our mindsets. Because seeing really is believing. So if we don't see women in leadership positions, we don't naturally associate leadership with women. So they are very effective. Now, they have drawbacks, and the evidence from Norway, where you know that Norway introduced quotas on its board, 40% of the board members have to be female. The evidence is young, so I don't think we should read too much into the evidence, but the evidence is mixed. So some of the companies actually perform worse these days, and one of the reasons for that, the research suggests, is that women are less likely to fire people. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? You know, it's up to you to decide that. But if you just look at performance as the evidence, that's what that evidence suggests. But let me add one more point, and that is, I just talked about mindsets in passing, and I think in particular now that we think a bit more about organizations and the work that Sadia is leading so effectively, we really have to think hard about the stereotypes that affect our judgments and our decision making, and all of us fall prey to those stereotypes. So this is not about pointing fingers, because seeing is believing, and we now have tests where you can measure how biased you are. And unfortunately, I'm predicting most of you will find that you're sexist and racist and nationalist on all the kind of things that you don't want to be, because I am, everyone who's ever taken the test is, because this is how our world is. And so an alternative approach that we're working on at the Women in Public Policy program is something that we call nudges. And that is, we want to change the environment to make it easier for people to get things right. So nudges are for good people like you and me who don't want to discriminate, but in the moment, because how our minds work, and because we are affected by these stereotypes, find it hard to do so. If I may give you an example. So we think about, many ways we think about gender equality or these biases, the way you might think about healthy nutrition. So this is a big leap, but I'll walk you through. So here's how I think about this. So imagine you want to eat healthily. Therefore, you probably don't have stacks of ice cream in your freezer. I'm arguing treating men and women equally is a bit like eating healthily. We kind of want to do that, and we really, really want to do that. But because the world is the way it is, when we evaluate candidates for promotion or when we think about hiring people, we will fall prey to those stereotypes. And we will associate math types of jobs with men. We will associate verbal types of jobs with women. We will associate leadership with men. It's just in our makeup, because that's how the world is. And so how can we change that? By not having ice cream in the freezer. For hiring and promotion, that means, for example, if you hire in bundles rather than sequentially, diversity is much more likely to emerge. Very important for academia. I'm the academic dean now of the Kennedy School. Very important. We tend to hire sequentially, and every time we're like, yes, we tried so hard, but again, same white Ivy League, male American, what we've always had. So now we bundle searches. So there are insights into how our minds work that will allow us to create what I call psychologically smart institutional designs, which will decrease the impact stereotypes have, not because we are so enlightened, because it's hard to be so enlightened, but because we made it easy not to eat the ice